Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States, and unlike his first term, this time he is well prepared both in terms of personnel and program. The Republican Party is largely behind him. Both chambers of the Congress are in Republican hands, and even the Supreme Court aligns with his views. In short, Trump is significantly better prepared and will be able to accomplish far more than he did during his first term. Now, the world and particularly Europeans must find a way to deal with him over the next 4 years. In this video, we will take a look at the security policy implications of Trump's victory. And with that, welcome to a new video on my channel. If you want to stay up to date on security and defense policy, feel free to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any of my future videos. Let's get started. Good news up front. Trump is very unlikely to withdraw from NATO completely. During his campaign, there was no more talk of leaving, and due to legal changes, he could no longer make such a decision unilaterally. However, Trump doesn't even need to leave NATO to undermine it. A statement from him declaring Article 5 null and void would already suffice. This brings us to his main concern regarding NATO. You gotta pay your bills. Trump will rightly demand that Europeans spend significantly more on defense. He has repeatedly made it clear that he would not defend countries that don't pay their dues. On the contrary, he would even encourage Putin to do whatever the hell he wants. This, most experts agree, should not be understood as a threat but as a promise. Moreover, Trump is very unlikely to settle for just 2% of GDP. During his first term, he already demanded that NATO allies should contribute more than 2% of their GDPs to defense. The focus will likely shift to ensuring that Europeans meet NATO capability targets, which will cost significantly more than 2% of GDP. Most experts agree that around 3% of GDP for defense would be required to meet the new capability targets of the alliance. If the Europeans want to keep Trump committed to NATO, they should significantly increase defense spending to remain an attractive partner for Washington. Apart from more general defense spending, good deals could also help keep Trump engaged with NATO. After all, nothing pleases him more than boasting about billion-dollar deals. It might therefore make sense to purchase a few more F-35 fighter jets and Patriot air defense systems from the US in the coming 4 years. Trump could show off these deals and we could strengthen our defense readiness. The key point here is that Trump is a transactional leader, and Europeans would do well to never forget this when dealing with him. However, the scenario described so far is the positive one for European NATO states. Even this would cost Europeans hundreds of billions of euros more over the next 4 years. But there are voices and plans in the US concerning NATO that would be far worse for Europeans than spending 3% of GDP on defense. One such idea is the concept of a dormant NATO proposed by Sumantra Maitra, Director of Research and Public Relations at the American Ideas Institute. Dormant NATO essentially means a sleeping NATO where the US acts merely as a silent partner. The concept envisions building a European security architecture in which US forces no longer form the backbone of conventional deterrence and defense in Europe, but are only available as a last resort. The US would retain its nuclear umbrella and a limited presence of its Navy and Air Force, but conventional deterrence and defense against Russia would fall entirely to the Europeans. The key term here is burden shifting instead of burden sharing. Rather than evenly distributing responsibilities between the US and Europe, as previously advocated, the burdens would be entirely shifted to the Europeans. While the US would still play an important role in defending Europe in the event of conflict, it would only do so to the extent that it doesn't weaken its defense posture in Asia. Furthermore, Sumantra Maitra advocates against further territorial expansion of NATO and supports a focus on its core missions. Maitra is not alone in this view, but is joined by others. For instance, the Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation, an ultra-conservative think tank, aligns with the dormant NATO concept. If this second, more challenging scenario were to occur, requiring Europeans to become more or less independent from the US, it would cost Europe a high three-digit billion sum and likely take longer than a decade to achieve. This brings us to the second topic with security policy implications for Europeans: the Russia-Ukraine war. One thing is certain: Trump wants to end the war as quickly as possible. He has repeatedly claimed that if he were president, he would end this war within 24 hours. While this is highly unlikely, the war will very likely either end or be frozen next year. In other words, Trump definitely wants to make some kind of a deal. Such a deal will inevitably include concessions to Russia, such as allowing Russia to retain the territory it has occupied and/or Ukraine foregoing NATO membership. The negotiations may possibly involve only Russia, Ukraine, and the US. If that doesn't highlight how irrelevant Europeans have become in security policy, I don't know what does. Ukraine will very likely have no other choice but to sit at the negotiating table and accept the outcome. This is because military support from the US will likely be significantly reduced, if not completely withdrawn. And Europeans will hardly be able to compensate for this, even though in theory they could. However, any potential deal will likely also demand significant concessions from Putin. What those might be is, of course, unknown at this time. Should Putin refuse to agree to a deal, Trump has already stated that he would provide Ukraine with everything it needs to win. A Lend-Lease program worth up to $500 billion is being discussed, backed by Ukrainian natural resources. This would allow Ukraine to borrow as much money as necessary to purchase US weapons to defeat Russia. Good for Ukraine, and it also spares US taxpayers, since no tax money would be used to support Ukraine anymore. Which of these scenarios will come to pass remains to be seen. However, if some form of deal does materialize, it would have far-reaching consequences for all of Europe. Russia would use the pause to rebuild its economy and rebuild its military. According to experts, this could happen within 5 years, especially with likely support from China, North Korea, and Iran. While a renewed Russian attack on Ukraine in the near future seems unlikely, it is expected that Putin will intensify his hybrid war against Europe as well as in Africa and the Middle East. He will continue to provoke NATO and possibly escalate, testing how far he can go. Unity within NATO, particularly among its European members, will be critical. But a potential ceasefire would also give Ukraine time to regroup and reorganize. Militarily, this would provide an opportunity to build new defense installations, train and drill personnel, and of course rearm its forces. For the latter, Ukraine will require foreign support, and Europeans in particular will be called up on. Further military support from the US is, as mentioned, quite unlikely. If Europeans fail to adequately arm Ukraine, the likelihood of another Russian attack increases. The economic and military stabilization of a potential deal will therefore fall to the Europeans. The US increasingly sees Russia and the war in Ukraine as a European problem, and truthfully, they are not entirely wrong. In addition to the war in Ukraine, the Middle East conflict also impacts the security interests of Europeans. Two key observations can be made here. First, Trump clearly sides with Israel, and second, he is likely to pursue a policy of maximum pressure against Iran. During his first term, Trump took controversial steps to support Israel, such as recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, as well as recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Furthermore, Trump is considered the architect of the so-called Abraham Accords, which normalized Israel's relations with several Arab countries. Some experts believe that Trump, in a second term, will continue this approach and may push for the normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Regarding the Gaza conflict, Trump is expected to support Israel but also press for a quick end to the fighting. Statements like "let Israel finish the job" illustrate this stance. He even personally threatened Hamas, stating if the hostages are not released by January 20, 2025, then there will be hell to pay in the Middle East and for those who committed these atrocities. Whether and what actions might follow these words remains to be seen. However, a tougher stance against Hamas and its supporters can be expected not only in the Middle East, but also within the US itself. For instance, Trump is reportedly planning strict measures against the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. This brings us to Iran, which is viewed as the second biggest challenge for the US after China. A policy of maximum pressure can be anticipated, aiming to isolate Iran diplomatically and economically through sanctions and military deterrence. However, Trump is cautious about direct military confrontation with Iran, fearing the prospect of another forever war. Trump's foreign and security policy focus will, however, primarily be on China, which is viewed as the greatest threat to the security and interests of the United States. The issue revolves around dominance in the Pacific region. Consequently, it is expected that Trump will adopt an even tougher stance towards China than the US already has, both economically and militarily. In this context, Trump will demand the allegiance of allies. However, Europeans in particular will face the challenge of being largely unable to comply due to their economic dependence on China. Europeans would therefore be well advised to use the next 4 years to reduce the dependency on China, not only as a goodwill gesture toward Trump, but also out of their own security interests. Regarding Taiwan, Trump could also expect greater European involvement. Should this be the case, it would be wise for Europe to comply. On the other hand, China perceives Trump as unpredictable and is likely to act more cautiously in the coming years, particularly in the Pacific region. However, China could instead increase its support for Putin and become more active outside of the Pacific region. Even though complete independence from the US would be desirable, it would take more than a decade to achieve and cost a high 3-digit billion sum. This means that over the next 4 years, we will have to engage with Trump whether we like it or not. Without US protection, we are completely exposed. To keep Trump in NATO and gain his favor, we must become attractive partners. This requires significantly more defense spending, likely 3% of GDP or more, and substantial alignment with his policies on China and Iran. Europeans will need to take responsibility for conventional deterrence and defense against Russia, as the US will increasingly focus on Iran and China. For Germany, this means not only spending much more on defense, but also taking on leadership, including military leadership. This, as is already clear, will be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, challenge for the next federal government. Should Germany and Europe fail in this regard, dark times await us. Times in which not the US, but Russia holds the dominant position in Europe. Let's hope we understand this now and experience a true Zeitenwende in the coming years, one that lives up to its name. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel so you can stay up to date on security and defense policy in the future. A big thank you to Moritz, who will undoubtedly do a great job editing this video again, and thank you to all of you for watching. Hopefully see you next time.